So our last stage of cellular respiration or aerobic cellular respiration is oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative because it needs oxygen, and phosphorylation because the key thing that it's going to do is take a whole lot of ADP and make ATP. If we were to account for how many molecules of ATP we've made so far, we've only made 4. It's ridiculous. We're going to make 28, give or take, molecules of ATP in this last stage. The last stage has 2 parts to it, and we need to get to the very end part to really have the big payout. So stay with it. We also have something that we haven't talked about yet in the key characters in this story of aerobic cellular respiration. We haven't talked about water at all. So in oxidative phosphorylation, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the electron transport chain. Here we've got all those electrons from our energy intermediates are going to be put through the electron transport chain. We should talk about where we're at in the cell. So we are still in the mitochondria, same as we were in the Krebs cycle. And the mitochondria had, if you remember, a double phospholipid bilayer. And so if you were to take a look across this inner mitochondrial membrane, we'd have a phospholipid bilayer in there. And we know phospholipid bilayers are sometimes called fluid mosaics. And they're called a fluid mosaic because they're made up of a bunch of different molecules. And one of those key molecules are proteins. And so what happens is those electrons are passed through that inner mitochondrial membrane, and a couple key things happen. We don't get into the details of how these things happen and the biochemistry of it, but the key thing that happens is that a whole bunch of hydrogen ions, so H pluses, are going to be pumped to one side of that chemical or of that cellular membrane. That's going to set up a concentration gradient. We talked about gradients last day when we talked about cell transport. And so when you pump up a concentration gradient, that gradient can be used as passive transport when it reestablishes equilibrium. So the other thing that happens is that we're going to finally talk about that water molecule. And so the electrons going through the electron transport chain do 2 things. They set up this hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and then they also go to oxygen, which we've talked about as being really greedy. It's highly electronegative. It really likes electrons. And so what happens is those electrons fall to oxygen and it combines with some hydrogen and we end up making H2O. This is the only time that we talk about making H2O, and it is one of the key things that comes out of the process of aerobic cellular respiration. So it's a big deal. You can't leave this character out of your story or your story wouldn't be complete. What also would not be complete is the big payout. So the second part of oxidative phosphorylation has that funny name of chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis uses an enzyme, another protein in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and that enzyme has a very sensible name. If chemiosmosis is not a sensible name, ATP synthase is. It's an enzyme that synthesizes ATP. That totally makes sense. It's descriptive of what it's doing. And this is the big payout. This makes 28 molecules of ATP. As a little note, this number is different in different resources, and as we've updated our textbook over the years, that number has actually changed in the publisher's typed stuff. So yeah, it's an estimate, and not every chemical reaction is going to be 100% efficient, but that's kind of a best case scenario. And definitely it's much bigger payout than any of the other stages so far. So we're not going to draw this one. It's drawn for you. I can use this to really illustrate the key things. So remember, the third stage is oxidative phosphorylation. It has 2 parts. It is the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So during the electron transport chain, we need the electrons from our electron carriers. They're going to be passed from protein to protein through that inner mitochondrial membrane. It's going to set up this hydrogen ion concentration gradient, so pumping more hydrogen ions to that side than are on this side. And the key thing here is that water is going to be made when those electrons eventually fall to the really greedy oxygen here. So now that we have the hydrogen ion concentration gradient, that can get used by the second part of oxidative phosphorylation. So the second part of oxidative phosphorylation uses an enzyme, ATP synthase, and this hydrogen ion concentration gradient. When there is a hydrogen ion concentration gradient, it can equalize. Hydrogens are going to move through, and that activates my ATP synthase here. And so it's going to be the big payout of ATP as it phosphorylates the ADP. So remember, oxidative phosphorylation, it needs oxygen, and the key thing that it's doing is making ATP. It's phosphorylating ADP. Okay, that one is a lot. That's the one that I said you'll be tired by the time we get here. And really the key thing, this is the electron transport chain in kind of a simplified thing. So it does two things. The electrons go in, it's going to set up that hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and it's going to make water. Okay, if we were to go to your key stages of respiration chart, I have summarized it like this, and you can fill it out with your own take on it. This happens in the mitochondria. Yeah, it needs oxygen. Oxidative phosphorylation has the two parts, and so roughly I could divide it about there here. So the electron transport chain needs electrons. It's going to make a hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and it's going to make water. The chemiosmosis is going to use that hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and I've never put that in there before, but you could. That's an example of something you could add. Somebody, I think, convinced me to add it in there on this one another time. We need ATP synthase. You need that enzyme, and the big payout is the ATP molecules. So finishing this up, we have a good summary here. If you want to, you can trace this one through. I think I've put this in the review. There's nothing for you to complete on it, but it is a good pictorial of where these things happen, if they need oxygen or if they don't. So this doesn't need oxygen, it's anaerobic, and these last two stages do need oxygen. They're aerobic. And so you can see where the CO2 is produced. You can see that water's being produced, and we've got the payout of the 2 ATPs, 2 ATPs, and then 28 ATPs in that last one here. It also shows how those electron carriers get produced here, and then feed back into the later process. That's why they're intermediate in the chemical reaction. This one I just summarized on the picture, so if you like it in words, you can follow in the words, or like I did on the diagram, you could augment that diagram. Understanding aerobic cellular respiration allows us to see how things could go wrong. And so there's 3 different categories of poisons or toxins that can affect cellular respiration. Some of them are beneficial to humans, some of them are detrimental to humans. So the first category blocks the electron transport chain. If we block the electron transport chain, there's no setup for the big payout of chemiosmosis. And so things that work like this would be insecticides, specifically rotenone, cyanide poisoning, and then carbon monoxide poisoning as well. This is how it works on a cellular level. The second kind of poison or toxin inhibits that enzyme of ATP synthase. And so if we inhibit this enzyme, there's not that big payout of chemiosmosis. And so as an example that's more beneficial to humans but very detrimental to prokaryotes would be an antibiotic. So an antibiotic can work this way, and it's different. It doesn't kill eukaryotic cells, but it does kill the prokaryotic cells when you have a bacterial infection. The third kind makes that inner mitochondrial membrane leaky, and when the membrane is leaky, it can't set up the hydrogen ion concentration gradient. And without the hydrogen ion concentration gradient, then again, there's no big payout for the last stage. There's no chemiosmosis. And examples of this would be some wood preservatives, And then your textbook talks about a diet pill in the 30s that, yeah, for sure would make you lose some weight, but it might also kill you too. So understanding these chemicals are really important so we can understand how they work and then, maybe use them to our advantage or understand better about them in the least. So that's just illustrating the different stages of oxidative phosphorylation that these molecules work in. And maybe if you're a picture person, that helps. The last part for us to talk about is what if there's not enough oxygen? What if you've just run up 3 flights of stairs and you feel a burn in your muscles? What the heck is going on? That is a sign that your muscles have switched into aerobic respiration. So this is what happens when there's not enough oxygen. If you remember, glycolysis didn't need oxygen and it did produce some ATP. So your cells and other cells have a bypass of aerobic respiration with anaerobic respiration or fermentation. We have 2 kinds of fermentation that we can talk about in Biology 50. We could talk about lactic acid fermentation or we could talk about alcohol fermentation. So your cells produce lactate or lactic acid. Remember pyruvate, pyruvic acid, citrate, citric acid. There is this naming convention in biochemistry, and so these molecules is what's making your muscles feel like they do when you get to the top of 3 flights of stairs, or mine anyway. Maybe you're in better shape than me. And so really what this does, it allows for the process of glycolysis to be recharged. And so it's not a big payout, but this is the payout and this is the byproduct. Your muscle cells do it. Bacteria can make cheese or yogurt through this process. And you're basically regenerating what you need for glycolysis in this process. Not in your cells, but in other cellular organisms or cells in organisms, the byproduct is ethanol, and this is an alcohol. So we call this alcohol fermentation, but it works similarly. Again, we've got glycolysis that can happen without oxygen, and it does produce ATPs. So this process basically recharges what we need to keep glycolysis happening. And this is how other things can survive when there's not enough oxygen present. So an example of this would be yeast. If you've ever done any brewing or fermentation, you keep the oxygen out, and this is how beer and wine is made. And other things are fermented, and so vinegars, that kind of thing. So yeah, that does our chapter 6.